We're soon to be joined on MO Forum by Bernard Keane. Bernard Keane is from Crikey, which is an online news and commentary company. Bernard has been writing in Canberra for Crikey since 2008. We're going to be discussing climate change and responses to climate change. And I wanted to just explain to you three concepts that we will inevitably talk about. The first is an emissions trading scheme. The second is a carbon tax, and the third is the proposed direct action plan. An emissions trading scheme is otherwise known as a cap and trade scheme. The cap is a limit on overall emissions of carbon into the atmosphere, and that limit in Australia's case is a 5% reduction by the year 2020 compared with 2000 levels. Both parties have committed to that target. So that provides an overall limit on how much carbon can be released into the atmosphere. And in order to be able to release carbon into the atmosphere, businesses are required to buy a permit from the government. Now, when they do buy that permit, if it turns out that they can reduce their emissions and have extra permits, they can actually sell them to another business that wants to increase its emissions within the overall cap. It may be a new business or an expanding business. So they can actually trade in these permits, and that's why we have a cap and trade system, and it is a market-based system. The second concept is a carbon tax. This is simply a fixed number of dollars per tonne of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. The third concept is a direct action plan, which is proposed but not yet well defined by the coalition government. Under the direct action plan, the government, on behalf of taxpayers, would actually pay companies that are emitting carbon into the atmosphere to reduce those emissions. So they would actually, on behalf of taxpayers, give them money to reduce their emissions. What's not clear is whether other companies are able to increase their emissions, because there's no carbon price, there's no trading amongst companies. This is yet to be defined, but essentially the emissions trading scheme is a market-based mechanism. The direct action plan is a government-determined program. One actually charges companies for emitting into the atmosphere. That's the emissions trading scheme. The direct action plan pays companies to reduce their emissions into the atmosphere. Welcome to this episode of MO Forum. We're joined by Bernard Keane of Crikey.
G'day.
And Bernard has been communicating his views about a couple of issues, the direct action plan and climate change more generally, and also this debate about productivity growth in Australia and the assertion that it slumped under the previous government, but now it's going to be lifted if some very tough measures are applied. So I just wanted to welcome you, Bernard, to the
Good to be here.
MO Forum. This is really about progressive thinking and setting an agenda for people who do want to create a better world, and through a progressive line of thought. And that's why it's so great to have you here on MO Forum. So let's start with climate change. I think now, notwithstanding a few comments from former Prime Minister John Howard, there is pretty strong consensus that there is such a thing as human-induced climate change.
There's a very strong consensus from the people who make a living from examining the issue of climate change. I mean, this is the great flaw at the heart of the climate denialist story, which is that somehow there is either some form of conspiracy or monumental incompetence on a global scale from the part of climate scientists who have somehow got it wrong. That the basic physics of climate change and then the demonstrated impacts of greenhouse emissions, not just carbon emissions, but greenhouse emissions on worldwide temperatures, climate scientists very strongly of the view that climate change is real, anthropogenic climate change is real. It's not just some natural cycle that we've just got to sit back and cop, and that adjusting our level of carbon emissions can actually have an impact. Now, ultimately, the one of the points I like to make is that climate denialism ultimately defaults to conspiracy theory.
Yes.
Ultimately, the only rational argument you can come up with if you're a climate denialist is that all the evidence for climate change is ultimately a fabrication by a very large conspiracy. I mean,
very elaborate conspiracy.
Very elaborate. Forget the killing of JFK. I mean, this is we're talking about a global conspiracy involving thousands and thousands of people who are all in on it. This is why those emails from East Anglia University a few years ago were seized on with such a determination by climate denialists, because they tried to argue they were evidence of this conspiracy. But if you are in any way prudent, then you don't base public policy, you don't base investment decisions if you're a business person on long shots and conspiracy theories. You base them on what is prudent, what is most likely. I mean, if I was someone like Maurice Newman, who's a eminent business figure, is a climate denialist. David Murray, ex-head of the Future Fund, another climate denialist. There are a lot of people in the business sector who are climate denialists. And the basic question really for them is, would you run a business based on the logic that you're deploying about climate change, which is that it's a giant conspiracy rather than the result of the consensus of the people who are actually experts in this area? You wouldn't invest in a business on a long shot that it's not a conspiracy theory. So that sort of prudential logic seems to go missing from the climate denialist case.
And perhaps to extend that analogy, if someone is making an investment, a monetary investment in the future, they don't wait until there is no uncertainty whatsoever before making that investment.
Exactly.
You make it in the real world where there is some risk. Now, even those people who are sceptical about human-induced climate change should be prudent, but also should not wait, you'd think, until the last scientist on Earth steps up and says, that's it, I'm finally convinced, because that last scientist will not step up. Well, there'll always be someone.
There are people who believe that the moon landing is a fake. There are still people who believe the Earth's flat. I mean, you're never going to get absolute consensus. That's not how science works anyway. Science doesn't work by
proof,
by groupthink. Science works by hypotheses and trying to
and evidence.
And look, you're never going to get full consensus from science. Science doesn't work that way, in any event, we don't know the full range of climate impacts. So if we're assuming that there's going to be between a 2 and 6 degree warming globally between now and the end of the century, that's a range. That's an enormous range in itself, and that range encompasses an extraordinary variety of impacts on a country like Australia. So planning climate or planning policy based on that itself is immensely problematic. You're not going to know the exact nature of the impacts and how is the environment going to react to it, what feedback loops are going to be created. So you can't create policy in perfect certainty when it comes to climate change anyway, even if you accept the science.
All right. Well, this would be another perspective of people who might accept the science of climate change, but then put this proposition. I'd be interested in your views. To pick up your point there, a lot of these impacts are already going to occur because of the emissions that have been released into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, but most particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades. So, based on that, if we can't fix it, we should adapt to it. That is, deploy adaptation strategies rather than mitigation strategies. Which would be improve our flood insurance arrangements, build higher levies and so on. What do you say to that proposition?
Well, there's a lot of good sense in that because we are going to have to do that. I mean, as policymakers are going to have to deal with the fact that there will be a level of climate change. It's already happening and it's going to have impact. So we need to have both a mitigation and an adaptation strategy.
Yeah.
There's no point sort of saying, well, we can stop this, we can reverse it.
Yeah.
Because climate change, even on the most optimistic scenarios, is going to occur anyway. So we do need an adaptation strategy, and that means, and that's where the climate denialist case, gets very shaky, because if you're running an insurance company, you know perfectly well that your financing over the next 20 years is going to be significantly affected by climate change, and your reinsurer will know that very, very well. So yes, adaptation is an important issue, but it can't be the only approach. I mean, ultimately that's a kind of a let the planet burn approach, which is, we'll just sit back and continue to pump greenhouse emissions into the atmosphere. We'll just accept whatever consequences come without really worrying about, well, where does the prudential response lie? And then the prudential response is always going to be a mix of mitigation and adaptation. Some forms of mitigation are very expensive, and you wouldn't do them.
Yeah.
And in fact, Australia's got a history over the last 15 years of running greenhouse abatement programs, greenhouse abatement programs that are extraordinarily expensive. So when you're making the sort of trade-off between adaptation and mitigation, one of those issues has got to be cost, and adaptation has to be a significant part of that mix.
Well, to continue the analogy, now you've got me thinking about this, the insurance company, it will itself and think, what can we do to reduce the risks of these catastrophic events occurring? So it's one thing to insure people, but having insured them, there's an incentive on an insurance company to get people to put locks on their doors, to make sure that their houses are reasonably well built, that the roof doesn't fly off very easily. So it seems to me that's an analogy with humanity. I mean, we're custodians of the earth, and we're trying to ensure, again, for future generations and nature itself, to say, well, look, we'll just adapt. We won't actually seek to reduce the risks of climate change. Goes against the market principles to which some of the people you mentioned readily subscribe.
Particularly when the cost is actually relatively small. I mean, we've seen this with the carbon price in Australia. Now the extent to which it's driven the sort of plateauing of emissions that we've seen over the last sort of 12 months is unclear. But nonetheless, the cost of action in terms of mitigating emissions is actually not that significant in terms of the overall economic impacts. The problem is it goes up over time. The longer we wait, the higher the costs are going to be. And this is the other issue that I think gets overlooked. At some point in the next, 50 years, Australia is going to have to decarbonise its economy.
And why do you say that? For the reason
unless you assume that climate change is a giant conspiracy, then we are going to have to significantly reduce the carbon intensity of our economy. Otherwise, the rest of the world is. Australia is one of the most carbon-intensive economies in the world. Yeah. We're up there with the oil sheikdoms in terms of the emissions intensity of our economy, mainly because of the way we produce power.
Yeah.
There's other factors we can't.
Coal-fired power
exactly. There's other things. There's things we can't do anything about, like the fact that we're a big country with a small number of people. So our transport is emissions intensive.
Yeah, I understand.
But it's because we rely so much on coal-fired power that we have this extraordinarily emissions-intensive economy. At some point in the next sort of 50 years, we're going to have to address that. And the longer we wait, the more expensive it will be.
And the bigger the damage to our competitiveness, you would think at some point.
Exactly. And if we leave it until the last minute, well, it's going to have a huge cost. It's going to be immensely disruptive. If we do it over an extended period, then the costs are actually going to be relatively small.
The transition costs are lower. Yeah.
If you look at, for example, the impact on CPI of the carbon price, it's been almost negligible.
Yeah, I think it was 0.7%.
Well, that was a Treasury estimate, and I think it's actually come in just a shade under the Treasury estimate. So, and it's that's the impact has been extraordinarily small, in fact. So,
and also you talked about the emissions have fallen. They've actually fallen in the energy sector. That's where you probably want them to, based on your analysis, that we are probably unusual in the world in that we rely so heavily on coal-fired power stations, and that's actually where the reductions are occurring. So the carbon price is actually working, it seems to me.
Well, we also had a kind of de facto carbon price even before the one that was introduced by the federal government, which was, for years we had power generators and particularly power transmission companies, mainly government-owned ones, gold plating and over-engineering the network and charging consumers for it. That's what's driven this massive spike in
electricity prices,
sustained spike in electricity prices. And that has actually caused a significant fall in consumer demand for electricity. People have actually responded to the price signal. It's not a price signal that's based on carbon pricing. It's a price signal based on the fact that we've got this inadequate regulatory framework for the electricity sector. Indeed. So we've had a de facto carbon price, which has actually caused people to cut their electricity usage. Now, that's actually where you want it cut, because you want to drive the transition of the electricity generation sector to A, more efficiency, and B, renewable or less carbon intensive.
I think the figures are roughly that there's, in the last few years, there's been a 70% average increase in electricity prices, of which 10% is carbon pricing, the other 60 from this gold plating. And the reason for the gold plating overinvestment is that they get a guaranteed return on investment of 8.4%.
Exactly. We have a regulatory framework that basically says to network owners, you can spend what you like, and you can then go off and charge consumers the cost of it.
And get an 8.4%
and get a guaranteed rate of return. And there is, it's only now that we're kind of moving to address the regulatory framework, but for a number of years we've had a de facto carbon price, which has cut our carbon emissions. So if Greg Hunt is desperate for policy solutions, then one of the things he could do is just sabotage any efforts to actually reform the electricity market, because it is going to continue to, I suspect, put pressure on consumers to cut their electricity.
And that 8.4% return is riskless. Compare it with a return on US Treasury bonds of 0.25%.
Yep.
If you're an investor, you don't need to be an investor who's an expert in electricity, in the electricity industry. You just say, I've got $1 billion, let's stick it in and get an 8.4% guaranteed return.
Exactly. Because you can go out and a company can go and charge consumers that. Those prices are signed off by the electricity pricing regulator, and that's what the only risk ultimately is consumers curb their usage.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned an alternative here, the direct action plan. To the extent that we understand it, there was a document that was out before the election. You've controversially suggested that the government abandon the direct action plan. I thought you were concerned about climate change, and wouldn't it be better to have a direct action plan to reduce emissions?
It'd be better to have a direct action plan if one actually worked. If it was actually going to drive a significant reduction in our emissions, but more to the point, achieve the goal that both the current government and the previous government say that they're committed to, which is a 5% reduction in our emissions by 2020, which incidentally is a deadline that's not very far away.
No.
It's a little bit closer than it used to be, as they say in the classics. So the problem with direct action is it's at best an extraordinarily expensive way of reducing carbon emissions. I referred earlier to the fact that over the last 15 years there's been a number of programs that purchased abatement at very, very expensive levels. Now, direct action is really a continuation of those sort of programs that were mainly run by the Howard government, a couple run by the Rudd government as well, in which the Australian National Audit Office found that they were buying abatement at the cost of several $100s a tonne in some cases. That's the outlier figure. The average cost was probably in high double figures, but nonetheless it was extraordinarily expensive compared to a carbon price.
Yes.
Now, direct action, to the extent that we understand it, will continue that. It will be a grants program. Basically, the government buying abatement from whoever is prepared to offer it, in the same way that it procures defence weaponry or tenders for building roads, and it's riddled with problems. I mean, the biggest problem for me, and this is one that gets very little attention, is that if you're a company that was already engaged in a significant energy efficiency program, for example, to reduce your emissions, why wouldn't you say, you Butte,
put your hand up?
I'm going to go and tender for Greg Hunt's direct action plan. So a lot of abatement that was already going to happen will be funded. There won't be so there's a real issue about what additional abatement will be funded by this. It will be bought. What abatement will be bought at a very expensive level, and the overall sense, really, for me, for this program has always been it's a fig leaf for the fact that the coalition doesn't really want to do anything about climate change. And if that's the case, why don't they just be intellectually sort of rigorous about it?
And say $3.2 billion.
And say $3.2 billion, which they could redirect to. There's plenty of other, worthwhile policy causes that could do with $3.2 billion. And this is why Treasury, when I think it was Greg Combay, got them to cost or look at the effectiveness of direct action, said, well, it's only going to achieve a fraction of the 5%. So you're going to have to actually spend a whole lot more to achieve the 5%.
And I think that big balance was the whole lot more was to buy. This would be ineffective, and if you're going to hit the 5% reduction, you'd have to go and buy permits. But then they've ruled that out from overseas, they ruled that out.
Exactly, either buy permits from overseas or increase the budget for the program. And of course, if you increase the budget, what are you doing when you're procuring? Well, it means that you're going to go off and buy the next most expensive form of abatement. I mean, if you have been buying based on lowest price, then if you've got more money to spend, you're going to be spending more money on more expensive forms of abatement. So it becomes even less efficient if you pump more money into it. This is why Malcolm Turnbull, I think, very correctly said that this is a program designed by people who don't believe in climate change, because it's easily wound up. Unlike a carbon price, we're going to see all sorts of problems with the repeal of the carbon price. This is a grants program that's easily wound up, and as Malcolm Turnbull correctly said, if you actually apply it seriously, it will have a big impact on the budget. So he quite cleverly, I thought, anticipated the Treasury analysis, which said this program is not sufficiently costed to.
An unresolved question in my mind about this direct action plan is, while the government's over here busily buying permits from, or paying, not buying permits, but paying businesses to reduce their emissions, what's to stop other businesses from increasing theirs? And new businesses setting up and say, well, why can't I emit?
Exactly. And going off and, it wouldn't happen, but going off and building a new aluminium smelter, for example. What's notionally designed to stop it is that the other component of the direct action plan is a baseline emissions mechanism by which, if you exceed a level of emissions, then you will be fined.
That sounds like a carbon tax.
Sounds like a carbon tax. Quite how it isn't a carbon tax has not really been explained. In fact, the whole baseline emissions mechanism has not been explained, and I assume that in the forthcoming white paper we'll start to see some details. But we don't even know, for example, is it a net emissions baseline scheme, or is it a emissions intensity baseline scheme? I.e., if I expand my business, but the emissions intensity falls. So my overall exactly. So do I get fined because my emissions have gone up, or do I?
How many businesses will be?
This is the other significant issue, because
covered by this scheme of fines above a particular.
The carbon price is only limited. The carbon price is limited to about 500 odd firms.
Might have been less in the end, but anyway, no more than 500.
Of a certain level. Who's captured by this? I suppose we'll find this out in the discussion paper. But the problem with that is that I assume it must be an emissions intensity scheme, because if you have a net emissions scheme, no business that produces emissions could grow.
No.
So clearly
it would exceed its baseline
immediately. As soon as it actually sort of increased its size in any way or increased production, it would be in breach of the emissions. So it can't be a sort of an overall emissions figure. It must be an emissions intensity scheme. How that's going to be measured, what the Are we going to use the existing baselines for industry? Are we going to have a sort of industry average, or is it going to be a firm-based? Because all these questions are, well, maybe we'll find out.
Former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry just a couple of weeks ago described this direct action plan to the extent that people do understand it as bizarre. That rather than setting up a market, you're doing this central planning and allocating permits to businesses, but there's no real price on them, because if there's no cap, then there's no price, except you're paying people money.
This is the problem with the base. The baseline is designed to kind of act as a kind of pseudo cap, but unless you actually make it, a very, very hard line mechanism, it's not going to function as a cap at all.
Yeah.
I'll tell you an anecdote about this, because this was cobbled together. The direct action was cobbled together by Greg Hunt after Malcolm Turnbull was rolled and replaced by Tony Abbott. And Tony Abbott basically said to him, we need a fig leaf for the fact that we don't want to do anything about climate change. I'm assuming he didn't say that exactly, but that was what Greg Hunt was tasked to produce. And for a long time, Greg Hunt was focused on the issue of soil carbon, which is this idea that you can get a lot of what's called biosequestration, i.e. you can somehow plough carbon into the soil and keep it there. That's the crucial thing. Not you can get carbon into the soil easily. Keeping it there is the significant thing. He was very big on soil carbon. Lenore Taylor memorably decided to christen direct action soil magic because it was so heavily dependent on soil carbon. If you look at the original costing for this program, it was heavily based on, it was dependent on 60% of the abatement. So 60% of that 5% goal based on $8 to $10 a tonne of abated carbon. And the assumption from Greg Hunt back then was soil carbon was going to do that. Now, something very interesting happened in 2010. He went to a farm in Dan Tehan's electorate, and a farmer who'd been doing a lot of soil carbon.
This is in Victoria. Dan Tehan,
and he met with a farmer who'd been doing a lot of soil carbon initiatives. And it all kind of came a cropper because, and this is recorded in the local paper, the farmer said to Greg Hunt, your $8 to $10 is not going to be anywhere near enough to actually encourage me to do more soil carbon initiatives. And that actually makes sense because if you talk to experts in the sort of biosequestration area, they'll tell you at the very best, if you want to pursue soil carbon initiatives, you're going to get maybe $20 to $40 a tonne. That's the best guess.
Right, which is way above the carbon price.
Way above the $8 to $10.
Yeah. And way above the global carbon price to which Australia would move in 2015.
Exactly. So after that, interestingly, I don't know whether it was cause and effect, but it was certainly sort of coincidental with it. Greg Hunt began talking about the whole scheme as a market mechanism. Not winner picking, but a market mechanism, which is kind of like saying, well, if I go down to the shop and buy a bottle of milk, I've created a national milk market. It doesn't quite work that way. You don't create markets just by going and buying something, particularly when you've just dismantled, which is what they're planning to do. But I mean, Greg Hunt's very sort of determined to say this is a market mechanism because we're going out and kind of sourcing it from the market. Well, that's actually, I think Greg Hunt's a lawyer by training, so might reflect his sort of poor grasp of economics on that particular issue. But that was when it switched from being, mainly about soil magic to being about a market-based mechanism. Yeah. And, arguably that's actually kind of sensible because the idea of the idea of basing the whole thing on $8 to $10 going out and buying soil carbon from farmers just wasn't ever going to stand up. And of course, that's before you get to the problem that no one can actually guarantee that if the government goes and spends $3 billion on soil carbon over the next 5 years, in 20 years, all that carbon's going to come straight back out of the soil because there's a drought. Yeah. There's ways of addressing that.
Yeah.
But there's risk-based ways of addressing
carbon capture and storage.
But it's not. It ain't carbon capture and storage. It's not sort of locked down in the bowels of the earth. It's in the soil. On a farm or in a tree that could be burnt out by a bushfire. So
it does sound a bit bizarre, I must say, that they're going to destroy a market in order to create a market.
That's the great trading scheme. That's the great sort of. I think that's the great sort of policy tragedy of all this is that Australia's actually put in place a reasonably good. I'm not 100% happy with the policy mix that the government with the Greens, then government with the Greens and the Independents put together. But nonetheless, it was better than the Kevin Rudd CPRS, and I think ultimately was going to drive in the long term carbon abatement, and it did not have a significant economic impact. Yeah. The Australian economy is still one of the world's best economies.
Whyall's still there.
Whyall's still there. Well, as you so famously attested. So, and yet now we've got a government that is simply going to destroy that market, a functioning market, and I think it's no wonder other countries are going to look at Australia and go, "What on earth?
What's going on?
Are you doing?"
And this, I think, unfortunate discussion is that this is a carbon tax and it's not an emissions trading scheme. What struck me is that the original carbon pollution reduction scheme was always regarded as an emissions trading scheme. It had a fixed price permit for 1 year.
Yep.
The Clean Energy Plan has a fixed price permit for 3 years, which would expire in 2015.
Yep.
One is called an emissions trading scheme, the other is called a carbon tax. And people don't like taxes, so they say, yeah, down with the tax.
Yeah.
This emissions trading thing, well, we don't quite know what it is, but that's not so bad. Well, this is an emissions trading scheme.
Well, one of the things about the emission trading scheme is 99.9% of the population have no idea what an emission trading scheme is, and I don't blame them because
they don't really want to know, and that's fair enough.
It's a very complex issue, but there's one thing certainly is that something you don't understand is better than something that you don't like.
Yeah.
Which is a
tax. Yeah.
So, and the roots of that, of course, go back to the fact that Labor never effectively addressed Tony Abbott's politically, in terms of political tactics, brilliant line, a great big new tax on everything. That was never actually addressed by Labor.
Yeah.
And that's I think we're still seeing the consequences of that years later.
But we're told that the reason that this scheme is being removed, the clean energy scheme, the ETS, the carbon tax, whatever you like to call it, is to improve Australia's competitiveness because productivity growth in this country has slumped, we're told, over the last 5 years after going very well before that. I know that on Twitter you've had something to say about this. What are the basic facts of the situation about productivity growth and competitiveness?
Okay, the basic facts are that Australia, like a lot of other Western countries, has been in a bit of a productivity hole now for over a decade.
Yeah,
we're certainly not Robinson Crusoe there. New Zealand, which is often held up as a free market nirvana, for example, has had very, very similar sort of productivity issues. Now, that's actually been reflected across a range of. It's been reflected in labour productivity, and it's been reflected in the overall multi-factor productivity thing as well, and capital productivity. Now, exactly what's been going on there, well, economists are still debating it. There's a number of theories. In Australia, a lot of it's focused on the mining boom and the fact that our mining company's been investing in a lot of less productive mines that are investing a lot in capital, and the returns from that haven't come through. But there's a number of explanations as to why there's been a long-term impact on productivity. But in Australia, something very interesting has happened in the last 2 years, which is that our labour productivity has actually increased significantly. And in fact, most recently, I think it increased at the highest level for 10 years.
Yeah.
So the Fair Work Act was, we were told by conservatives and by business groups when it was brought in, would destroy jobs. Malcolm Turnbull actually said that it was going to destroy jobs, and it was going to reduce productivity because it imposed restrictive, kind of unflexible provisions that prevented employers from operating flexibly. And of course, when they use the word flexibility, they mean flexibility to reduce wages, not to. Yeah, there's nothing. I've never actually heard of anyone explaining any sort of regulation that stops an employer from paying someone more.
So the problem is not flexibility.
Yeah, there's plenty of flexibility upwards. The problem is the flexibility go downwards. But the result, the evidence has been that, because Fair Work Act has now been in for I think 3 years, is that it has overseen we don't know what the causal relationship is, but certainly has coincided with a strong growth in labour productivity, certainly far higher than what happened under, for example, work choices under the Howard government. Now, labour productivity under work choices fell off a cliff. It fell. Didn't go up, it fell.
Yeah.
Now, was that because of work choices or did it just coincide with it? Well, there's an answer to that question. That answer is Treasury advised the then Treasurer, Wayne Swan, work choices is going to reduce productivity. They actually told him that. And the reason why it reduced productivity was because if you lower wages and reduce conditions and attack unions to stop them representing workers, you will bring into the workforce people whose skills were not sufficient to get into the workforce at a higher level of
the so-called marginal workers.
Exactly. So you bring more marginal workers in. They are low skilled by and large. They're not people with great skills sitting around waiting for a job. They are low skilled or unskilled workers who are suddenly cheap enough to employ. And as Treasury explained to Costello, that will reduce productivity because these are not the most productive workers.
You said Wayne Swan earlier.
Peter Costello. Apologies to Wayne. So Treasury explained that, saying, look, if you basically lower the price of labour, then you'll get less productive workers. Now, that as a policy goal, that may well be fine.
Because you want these workers to get into the workforce.
You're increasing participation. You've got these people who probably, they're probably long-term unemployed or often you want to get them back into the habit of working, before you start giving them skills. So this is arguably, a worthwhile policy goal. It's nothing to do with productivity.
No.
But there is this sort of blurring of issues by advocates of workplace deregulation to say that workplace deregulation is a cure-all.
Yeah.
That it'll fix everything, but you can't fix everything. You can't have higher participation and higher productivity, not in the short term.
No.
So
and people say our wages are too high in Australia, and therefore we can't be productive. But labour productivity is GDP per hour worked. There isn't a wages figure in the denominator; it's per hour. So if your GDP is growing and you're faster than your hours work, your productivity is growing. But it seems strange that people argue that the reason that we have less than satisfactory productivity is that wages are too high.
No,
it's got nothing to do with it.
It's got nothing to do with it, and it betrays the real incentive at work here, and that is that business are actually looking to deregulate the labour market in order to increase profit. It's not about increasing productivity. It's about increasing profit. And there's this, it's this old what's good for US steel is good for US. I mean, there is this mindset amongst business that if it's good for my bottom line, it's good for the nation. It's not.
Yeah. I saw some international comparisons for the years that you've just referred to, the most recent years, and amongst developed countries, Australia is outstripping other developed countries in productivity growth. You wouldn't know it from the debate that we see in the daily business newspapers about how it's terrible here, but it was good before. And in fact, as you point out, multi-factor productivity growth went negative in 2004, 2005. That's when work choices came in. Now, if people want to say industrial relations is the source of productivity growth, then this is a damning indictment on work choices.
Absolutely. I mean, the case against work choices in terms of productivity, I think, is pretty much sealed. It clearly, Treasury predicted it would cause fall in productivity. Fall in productivity happened, and we went back to we returned to a quote unquote more regulated IR framework under Fair Work Act. We've actually had an increase in labour productivity. So, the whole productivity argument is riddled with self-interest at best, better words probably greed, and a willful refusal to acknowledge the facts. An interesting issue is, and economists will debate this, but what's the relationship between the Fair Work Act and the overall IR framework and the increase in labour productivity? Did it cause an increase in labour productivity, or was it just coincidental? I suspect what's driven the increase in labour productivity over the last 18 months has been the Aussie dollar. I reckon in the trade exposed areas of the economy, a lot of businesses have said, bloody hell, we are up against it, and we need to do something. And they have sat down with their workers and found ways to actually increase workplace productivity. At the business level.
At the business level.
And this is the thing about productivity. Governments can't come in and wave a wand and say you'll be more productive.
Yeah.
It's up to businesses, managers, and workers to actually.
Well, you're not alone here, because Phil Lowe, Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank, has made the same point. He started writing about a first kick up in productivity about 2 years ago, and wondering whether it was a flash in the pan, because the figures jump around a lot.
Yeah, they're volatile.
And then over the last 18 months, he's been saying, I think it's here, and it's not temporary, and it is because of the competitive pressure exerted by the high Australian dollar. Exactly the point you're making, that businesses say in order to stay alive, we're going to need to do things better. They work out ways of doing things better, but it's not really, so long as the industrial relations system doesn't stop them from doing that. And evidently, the Fair Work Act has not stopped them from doing it.
There have been a few areas where the previous government's Fair Work Act review, it was a review after 2 years, but nonetheless, fair enough, found some areas where there was a case for reform, and that was fair enough. For example, I think that one of the issues is greenfields agreements. Very complex. Yeah. So yes, framework can always be reformed, but the basic sort of tenet, which is there has been a sort of attack on productivity by the Labor government, which is simply a complete fiction. And it's as I said, it's driven by the fact that business have this idea that if they can cut wages, they can increase profits.
Well, we've discussed two fictions here. One, that climate change isn't real, and that there's actually a global conspiracy, and a fiction about the impact of industrial relations on productivity, and the last couple of years, as you're pointing out, productivity growth has actually risen. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we could go on for hours, but I wondered if I could finish with this question, Bernard. If there's one thing in the world that you could change, what would that be?
Toughie. I mean, one feels tempted to kind of, talk about fixing world hunger, or, addressing the systematic oppression of women, or any of those sort of big things. But what I would change, if I ruled the world, would be I would make sure that we had an education system that gave our kids the basic skills of critical, skeptical thinking that will stand them in good stead in seeing through or seeing clearly in a very, very contested world. We've been talking about climate change, talking about productivity. How do you see through how do you know, well, what's really happening with the climate? Without becoming a climate scientist, how do you know? What are those basic skills of critical thinking that you need? Well, if what's the prudential position? What is prudence? What are the basic tools that you need to navigate your way through a very contested environment in which so many self-interested people are saying, let's do one thing or the other. So many self-interested people are saying things that aren't true.
Yeah.
Equipping young people with the skills to see through the bullshit, to approach every sort of issue skeptically but rationally.
Yes.
I think that would, in the long term, deliver us, a lot more benefits than somehow, coming and magically waving a wand and trying to fix all sorts of problems from above. Having faith that people actually can apply reason effectively and in a transparent way. That's what I'd change.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you on MO Forum, certainly enlightening on two big fronts, climate change and including the direct action plan and the economics of productivity growth, both very contested areas. And your final remarks there, I think, are poignant, because what you're doing through that recommendation is empowering people to make their own assessments rather than rely on the filtering of information through particularly the mainstream media, which has strong editorial positions on these sorts of issues, and people just get to read it and then either dismiss it altogether or believe it's true, the latter being more worrying than the former. Thanks very much for joining us on MO Forum. It's been a fascinating discussion.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Bernard. Why did you establish Hub Australia?
Okay, so I guess the real reason with these things, you don't really set out with a big official